Hi, readers. As we get into the higher grades, we often don't read aloud nearly as much as we should. We may have spent a lot of time reading aloud when we were first learning how to read, making sure that we understand and have grasped the language that's there, the sentence structure, the big ideas. Now, reading might feel a bit more independent, which is a good thing, but it doesn't mean that you should stop reading aloud because reading aloud is still a fantastic way to make sure that you're fully understanding a text beyond just the language. So when we get to higher level texts, we want to first think about parts of stories or texts that really stick with us, parts where we want to linger a little longer, maybe parts that really moved you, your feelings, maybe parts that you just can't forget, maybe parts that are really important to the story structure or the story arc overall, maybe parts that show something big happening to or inside of a character. So when you have a part in mind, maybe you have one right now, you might return to it. Maybe it's a part that you flagged. You might look at my independent reading book right here. You'll see there's a lot of stuff flagged. So I could return to one and think about some of the big things happening here on the page. And so when we get there to the part that feels important or worth lingering on, we want to really put this reading aloud into practice by thinking about what we've learned. So a few things, actually a lot of things to consider. One, you might think about point of view. This is a great chance for you to check in with yourself and make sure that you understand who is telling the story, especially in the part where you're reading. Who is telling the story? What's the narration? Along those same lines, you might think about the perspective in which the story is being told through. How does the narrator think? Does the narrator match what you think the author thinks and feels and believes? You also might think about the author's craft. Similarly to when we were learning how to read, we want to pay attention to words and punctuation. But here, you might think about the words and the punctuation as craft moves and how those are meant to develop ideas and beyond. You also could think about mood and tone. How does it feel in this part? How does it sound in this part? And then, of course, when we're reading stories, especially what we've been thinking about lately in class, we want to think about characters. What's being revealed about the character in this part? And what is being used to show it? Is it what they say, what they think, what they do, how they react? So just take a moment. It's a lot here. Take this chart in. There's a lot to think about, and that also means there's a lot to show off when you're reading aloud. All these things are taken into account. So right now I'm going to look at a part of Harry Potter, a part that really sticks with me, because for me, it shows something really big about the character or leads up to it. And before I read, I'm just going to think really deeply about these things. So a part that sticks with me and a part that feels significant to the character, Harry, is a part that's pretty deep into the first book, where Harry is about to see a mirror that reflects back to him some of his hopes, his dreams, his fears, his inner conscience. And he's sneaking around in Hogwarts and he could get caught. So he's like facing some trouble. And in this part right here, I want to make sure that I understand clearly, first and foremost, who's telling the story. I often get confused sometimes when I'm reading books that have the character's name in the title and think, oh, it's definitely through their point of view. But let me just double check that and think about who's telling the story and what they think. Point of view and perspective. Harry felt the blood out of his face. Oh, when the narrator refers to a character, especially the main character in the third person, right? Saying their name, third person. So we have a narrator who's not involved in the story. And from my understanding so far, the narrator is really sides with Harry most of the time, is on his side. And so I'm going to be keeping that in mind, especially when other characters come up. And so if Harry doesn't like another character or is afraid of them or feels a certain way towards them, the narrator and the speaker should also convey that through the voice too. Especially here because, for instance, Snape, a character that he sort of fears, doesn't really like, it's one of the professors, is in this section. So I should also make sure that my voice conveys how Harry feels and how the narrator feels about Snape. Other things to think about, definitely the punctuation. There gets to be some points where there's some like dashes, and there's also a lot of commas, like lists, pauses. I'm going to be really careful in those parts and pay close attention to them, making sure that I really use the punctuation to show the tone, the mood, and also even the pace in which this part might be read and told through. I also definitely want to think about the character, what this means for the character in this part. I might need to take a moment to really think deeply about what the character says, does, thinks, feels here, and what's really revealed about him. So now that I have taken some time to think about it, I'm going to read it to you. And I want you to think as I read about what I've considered. I want you to listen for evidence that I'm doing these things, or at least that I took these things into account before reading aloud. Harry felt the blood drain out of his face. Wherever he was, Filch must know a shortcut, because his soft, greasy voice was getting nearer, and to his horror, it was Snape who replied, the restricted section. Well, that can't be far. We'll catch him. Okay, how did I do? Could you tell that I thought deeply about all these things? Maybe you can tell that I've thought about the point of view, so it's a narrator, not Harry who's speaking. I feel like I'm not really conveying my understanding. For instance, in this little section here, this first part, like these first few lines, the blood drain out of his face. I should be thinking more about the character and what's being revealed about him. So like he's really afraid in this moment, or maybe like in shock. I should probably convey that through the way that I read this part. Also, other characters show up like Filch and Snape. So I should be clear on how Harry feels about them and also hearing them in this section. He's worried that they're going to catch him. He also is afraid of them and doesn't really trust them. He doesn't really have a very good relationship with Snape, especially. And also there's some dialogue here. I don't think it was really clear that there's dialogue. That would be an author's craft move to have the characters talking. So I should make sure that my voice shows that. And then definitely mood and tone. It's kind of spooky, right? Like blood draining out of his face. There's about to be some kind of magical, creepy stuff happen. That should come through my voice. Let me try that one more time. Listen closely for evidence that I've thought about these things, and maybe even give me a rating on it. How does it go this time, now that I thought about it a little bit more? Harry felt the blood drain out of his face. Wherever he was, Filch must know a shortcut, because his soft, greasy voice was getting nearer, and to his horror, it was Snape who replied, the restricted section, well, they can't be far. We'll catch them. Did you hear a difference this time? Did you hear some more evidence that I thought about the mood, the tone? I feel like this time around, I really tried to show you punctuation, or to use punctuation as I read. I took these pauses as well. I took a breath when there was a comma. I made sure to clarify or convey that there was someone else speaking. So when you go off to try this in your own book, remember that you want to first start by thinking about a part that feels important. Go back to something that moved you, that you can't forget, that felt important to the story, or now seems to be important to the story as you gotten deeper into the book. Maybe a part that shows something big about the character. And then before you read aloud, really do a double check or quadruple check of all these things, and probably more. There's probably even more that I could think about. But all the things you've learned to be true about stories, and all the things you've learned that stories use, you want to make sure that you are considering those here before you read it aloud. Then, once you do, you want to make sure your voice matches to your understanding of the text. So give it a shot, use my suggestions, and see how it goes. I can't wait to hear your voice and your understanding of the story.